Welcome to Practicing the Practices, a learning and experiential podcast geared towards helping you along on your spiritual formation journey. My name is Brad, and I'll serve as your host and coach. And in this brief introductory episode, I'll explain the why, what, and how behind this podcast. But before we get too far along, let me just say thank you for taking the time to click play on this episode. This is a local church podcast, but it's geared and shaped for a broad audience. So while we're creating these resources for the church where I pastor, we're hopeful and grateful if they'll be beneficial to followers of Jesus everywhere. I've spent the past 2 decades of my life pastoring in different communities. I've pastored in large urban contexts and in small rural communities. I've pastored in more traditional churches and churches that were less structured and kind of more evangelical, non-denominational types. The common thread through all of it has been this: Jesus entered this world as the very embodiment of good news. The gospel, as we say. And the gospel is good news about the redemptive story of God. Jesus has done the work to rescue and redeem us into his family. But the gospel is not just good news for some distant future reality with Jesus. It is an invitation to life with Jesus today. The invitation to discipleship or apprenticeship with Jesus is an invitation to a gospel-formed and gospel-empowered life. We've been invited to not only believe the gospel, but to express it, to imitate it. To embody gospel culture. Jesus is both the gift and our example. And that's the why behind Practicing the Practices podcast. Now, what'll make this podcast a little bit unique is that it's not designed to be exclusively informational in nature. We want it to be experiential as well. So it might always be best to listen to this podcast and multitask while you're doing the laundry or whatever, because we're going to want you to do more than just listen and learn. We're going to want you to practice what you're learning. And so a little bit more on that as we go along. Now, here's how we're going to make this happen. Once or twice a month, we'll drop an episode that focuses on what we call a practice of discipleship. Some people call them spiritual disciplines. You might call them habits of grace. Regardless of what you call these practices, we're going to briefly introduce and focus on one practice a month. Each episode will include a brief bit of explanation and motivation behind each practice, and a tutorial or an experiential segment where we actually, you guessed it, practice the practice. So go ahead and subscribe to Practicing the Practices on your preferred podcast platform. And we'll see you back here real soon for episode number 1.